I can't see anyone. There we go. Hi. So my name is Chris Soghoian. I'm the principal technologist at the American Civil Liberties Union. So I work for a human rights organization, and so I have 45 minutes here, and I think I'm the last speaker. So thank you all for sticking around. Hopefully that you're going to enjoy the next 45 minutes as I tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about how governments are adapting to changes in technology, how the needs of surveillance agencies are changing, and how governments are coping with the rise of privacy-enhancing technologies that make surveillance more difficult. So, again, I work for a human rights organization. I focus entirely on surveillance, and I've been working on these issues for probably 5 or 10 years now, depending on how you count it. And so I've seen a lot of these things change, and it's exciting to see world leaders talking about the stuff that you work on, in a way, but it's also terrifying when they get it wrong. So, so for 100 years, for more than 100 years, telephone companies have helped governments to spy. For more than 100 years, the governments of major countries have known that whoever they wanted to spy on, they would just ask one of their friendly telecommunications companies. For many of these years, these were state-controlled entities. And so these were just a part of the government. They would call them up and they would say, we want to spy on this person. Please let us listen to his telephone calls or her telephone calls. And of course, as technology advanced, initially it was the telegraph, and then it was the telephone, and then we have text messaging, and we have internet data on our mobile devices. As the services offered by telephone companies adapted, so too the needs of governments followed. And because there was a friendly relationship between the telephone companies and governments, the telephone companies ensured that their products were designed for surveillance. So what that means is that each time a telecommunications company started offering a new service to the public, they made sure that it could be wiretapped. They made sure that it could be surveilled, and governments were happy. And so just let that sink in for a second. What that means is that the communication services that we all rely on were designed first and foremost to be surveilled. At the design stage of every new communication service, governments were sitting in the room, and they made sure that they would be able to listen to communications. They would be able to get text messages. They could read emails. They could track location information. So you may have seen in the last few years that things have changed, and certain U.S. executives have been in the media for essentially what's happened is that these Silicon Valley tech companies, the Apples of the world, they have captured portions of the communications market. Consumers in the past would have given their communications to a telephone company to handle. Today, they give them to Apple. And the thing is, the philosophy of some of these tech companies is very different than the philosophy of the phone companies. The phone companies, first and foremost, see governments as a partner, in part because they're so heavily regulated and licensed that they need the government for permission to do everything. Companies like Apple don't see themselves quite as much as a partner of governments. And so Apple has really sort of led the industry in deploying technologies that are not designed with surveillance in mind. So, there's been a lot of controversy over the last few years, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but essentially Apple has done a few things. The first, they've turned on full disk encryption on their smartphone, which means that if you set a PIN number or password on your phone, Apple is not able to unlock it. They're not able to help the government to extract your information. Either the police have to break your PIN number or break your password, or they're not able to get in. Separately, Apple has also turned on a form of strong end-to-end encryption for both its iMessage product and its FaceTime product. So these are the default messaging solutions that's built into iOS and the default video conferencing and internet-based voice calling solution built into iOS. So Apple didn't require an opt-in. They didn't ask users to turn on a configuration option. They never even advertised this as an encrypted service. If you watch the commercials for FaceTime, Apple describes it as something that you would use to talk to your children when you're traveling, or grandchildren and their grandparents and grandchildren can keep in touch. But it turns out that Apple has delivered a very, very strongly protective and encrypted service to consumers, offered for free, turned on by default. Now, I don't want you to think this is some kind of commercial for Apple's products. I in fact, don't have an Apple tablet or an Apple laptop. But it's just an example of the ways that a company can suddenly roll out a product, and then 300 million people are suddenly getting end-to-end strong encryption. By the same token, about a year and a half ago, WhatsApp, the service now owned by Facebook, they rolled out strong encryption for their text message platform. Now 1 billion people have strong encrypted text communications that governments cannot easily monitor. Right? And so as I said at the beginning, for 100 years, governments have been able to listen to every telephone call they want to. For 100 years, governments have been able to get text messages, location data, web browsing data. As people got internet access to their homes, they could do full content intercepts to see who you were emailing, what you were emailing. Governments have been able to get everything. And in the course of just 3 or 4 years, suddenly 2 major tech companies, who are not from France, have given communication services to consumers that governments cannot easily monitor. So, as you might expect, governments are not responding lightly to this. And we've seen over the course of just the last year and a half, 2 years, a number of governments and senior government officials around the world call for these companies to change their approach. They've criticized the companies, and some officials in the United States have even said that these companies are knowingly helping terrorists and pedophiles and drug dealers. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has said that he doesn't want to provide a safe place for terrorists to hide online. Jim Comey, who is the director of the FBI, has responded to criticism and said, I'm not calling for a back door. He says, we just want to use a front door. For those of you who've been following this debate, technical experts describe a surveillance feature as a backdoor, but government officials are saying, no, we don't want that. We want a front door, which is very different. As far as we can tell, a front door is there by design, a back door is there secretly. This is Mike Rogers, the NSA director. He's even gone further than FBI Director Comey, and he's said, I don't want a back door, I want a front door, and I want the front door to have multiple locks, big locks. And so, this is an attempt by these government officials to respond to the criticism of the computer security community. So computer security experts say that if Apple or Facebook have to weaken or have to change their encryption, it will weaken the security of the system and make the system more vulnerable to compromise or hacks. And here you have the NSA director saying, look, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have the best of both worlds. We'll put an interception feature in, but we'll put lots of big locks around it, and so it'll still be secure. Now, most people in the security community do not agree with the NSA director, but I just want you to sort of understand the debate that's taking place. It really seemed like the debate was settled in the U.S. until the attacks in Paris, the unfortunate and horrible attacks in Paris last year, and that really reinvigorated the debate around encryption. In the hours and days after the attacks, there were media reports, unsubstantiated media reports, saying that the attackers used encrypted communication services to coordinate. And everything that's come out since, I think, has suggested that the attackers were using unencrypted SMS. They didn't have encryption on their devices. But regardless of the truth or the facts, that didn't stop national security advocates from saying that the Paris attacks demonstrated an even greater need to make sure that we have interception capabilities for encrypted communications. All right, so you have this debate of sorts. You have a debate where you have all the technical experts on one side, and then you have all the politicians on the other. The technical experts are saying that we shouldn't weaken encryption, that we shouldn't change are modern communication systems to make them more wiretap friendly. And then you have government leaders from France, from the United Kingdom, from Germany, from the US, all saying, this is out of control. We've always been able to listen to communications. It shouldn't change. We need to maintain the ability to listen to the bad guys' communications. And so what governments have proposed is essentially some form of key escrow, where not only does the user have a copy of their encryption keys, but a copy of their key is held by the service provider. It would be held by Google, or by Facebook, or by Apple, or France Telecom. And the idea then is that if the user does something bad, if the user becomes a suspect for the government, then they can call up, the government will get whatever kind of court order is required in that country, and then the government calls up Google and says, please give us this user's encrypted communications, please give us the key, and we decrypt the communications. So what's the problem with this key escrow model? Why are experts criticizing it? So I think a fantastic example of this came to light last year, right? So the communications between your cell phone and a cell phone tower are encrypted. And the encryption keys that protect your cell phone calls are stored on a SIM card that's in your phone. So it's a form of encryption called symmetric encryption, where the cell phone has a copy of the encryption key, and the phone network has a copy of the encryption key. So there are supposed to only be two players that have a copy of the encryption key, and as long as your SIM card doesn't get stolen, and as long as your phone company doesn't get hacked, then in theory, no one should be able to listen to your calls. So last February, The Intercept, which is the news organization that was started by Glenn Greenwald, they revealed that Gemalto, a French-Dutch company, the largest manufacturer of SIM cards in the world, had been hacked. Well, why would anyone hack into Gemalto? So it turned out that there weren't just two copies of the encryption keys in your SIM card. It wasn't just a copy in the SIM and a copy with the phone company. Turns out Gemalto kept a third copy of the keys. They kept it for themselves in case their wireless carrier customers lost the keys at any point. So they kept a backup copy. And so it turns out that GCHQ, Britain's intelligence agency, hacked into Gemalto and stole the keys. And then with these keys, the British intelligence agency was able to decrypt all of the communications of wireless carriers around the world who purchased Gemalto SIM cards. This is a fantastic example of what happens when you keep a copy of encryption keys. Whoever really, really wants to spy is going to find a way to get those keys. Okay, so let's not do key escrow. Let's find some other way of giving governments access to systems, or to giving governments access to communications. And many, many companies over the last few years have built what are called lawful interception systems into their communications networks. The telephone companies have them, many of the internet companies have them. And what we've seen time and time again is that if you build a surveillance feature into your network, even if the reason it's there is to let the good guys get access to data, even if it's just there for the police and your national security agencies under appropriate judicial and political supervision, it's really tempting for other parties to try and break in and use it. Because if you can successfully hack the surveillance system, you can get access to everyone's communications. So, 2009, Google revealed that they had been hacked by the Chinese government, but it wasn't until 2013 that the public learned that it wasn't the Google programmers who were hacked. It wasn't Google's source code or intellectual property that was stolen. China hacked into Google's surveillance system, the system that Google uses to respond to regular requests from the police in the UK, in the US, in France, in England, all of the democracies that Google responds to surveillance requests from. That dedicated team of people who respond to those requests, they got hacked, and the Chinese used that access to figure out which Chinese spies the US government was spying on. They wanted to figure out which of their own spies had been discovered by the Americans. Not only was Google hacked, but Microsoft was also hacked by the same Chinese team, and it was Microsoft's surveillance team that were hacked. Then, just a couple years ago, the Syrian Electronic Army, an online cyber hacking group linked to the Syrian government, also hacked Microsoft's electronic surveillance system. So that's twice that Microsoft's surveillance team has been hacked. And copies of emails were stolen, and sensitive customer information revealing which Microsoft customers had been spied on by US law enforcement. So if you think about Google and Microsoft, there's a lot of criticism of Google in Europe for their advertising practices, but I think we can generally acknowledge that Google probably does a pretty good job of security. Certainly much better than many other companies. Google employs more than 300 engineers who do nothing but cybersecurity. And so if Google cannot protect its surveillance system, if Microsoft cannot protect its surveillance team, what hope is there for any other company that is forced to build a surveillance feature into its network and then cannot keep attackers out? So, some companies are going to build their own electronic surveillance system, like Google and Microsoft, but other companies are going to buy off-the-shelf surveillance technology. Most telephone networking equipment includes built-in lawful intercept features. And so when you're a telecoms company and you're buying one of these devices, when you're a network and you're buying one of these devices, and then you get this surveillance feature, how do you know that it's good? How do you know that you are the only entity that gets to use the surveillance feature built into your network? So we have a couple good examples of this. The Intercept, again, the Glenn Greenwald outlet revealed last year, they had dug into this story. So in 2004, during the Olympics in Greece, a Vodafone engineer mysteriously committed suicide. And so what had happened, 8 years later, we learned what had happened. The Greek government had invited the US government in to help them with security for the Olympics. They invited the NSA in and said, please help us look for terrorist threats, people who are going to try and attack the Olympics. And the Greeks thought that once the Olympics were over, the Americans would stop listening. And it turns out that once you invite the Americans in, they never leave. And so after the Olympics were over, it was discovered that the NSA had been listening to the telephone calls of the Greek prime minister and members of his cabinet. So this was Vodafone Greece, Greece's largest phone company. They had paid for networking equipment with lawful interception features for the Greek authorities, and then the Americans came along and used it to spy on the Greek government. So this is, again, a risk that goes along with building surveillance features into your network. And then I think what is my favorite example of surveillance gone wrong, one of the Snowden stories that was reported, again, by The Intercept, the government of the Bahamas received a free gift from the United States of an entirely free surveillance system for their national telecommunications network so that the Bahamas government could look for drug dealers and other criminals and intercept their telephone calls. And the plan was to work hand in hand with the US Drug Enforcement Administration, and they would work together to find drug dealers who were, hiding their drugs or hiding their money in the Bahamas. And it was only after the Snowden stories started coming out that the public learned and the Bahamas government learned that this surveillance gift was in fact a Trojan horse. And while the Bahamas government thought it was just lawful interception, case-by-case individual phone calls, the NSA was using it to listen to every single telephone call in the country. Every single telephone call in the Bahamas was being recorded and sent back to the National Security Agency. In many ways, not because the Bahamas is some kind of terrorist hub or because it's some kind of national security threat, but because it was a small country where the NSA could test out this new capability of whole country interception. Right? So the moral of this story is be careful when someone offers you a free national wiretapping system. Maybe it's not going to be in your best interest. So, what we're hearing from government officials is that encryption is a threat. What we're hearing from government officials is that we need to remove the encryption, is that we need to weaken the encryption, is that we need to save copies of the keys with service providers. But I actually think that's the wrong approach. I think we actually need more encryption. I think we need much more encryption because our communications are so insecure. So everyone, of course, remembers just a couple years ago when Angela Merkel woke up one morning to the news in Der Spiegel that the National Security Agency had been listening to her telephone calls. So the technology that the NSA used is called an IMSI catcher. And an IMSI catcher exploits a 2 decades old security flaw in GSM networks and the networks that we all use for our telephones today. And the flaw essentially is that your cell phone cannot tell the difference between a real cell phone tower run by SFR or one of the big French companies and a criminal or a foreign intelligence agency pretending to be a phone network. So this technology has been in existence for 20 years. Actually, the Germans created the technology first, and then, of course, it was used against them. So this technology has been around for 20 years, and every government knows that this technology exists. So this is commonly referred to as a spy nest. This is a special listening booth on the roof of the Berlin US Embassy. And this is where we think the NSA was listening to Merkel's calls with one of these IMSI catcher devices. This is my favorite photograph. This is from Vienna, and this is the US, or this is the United Nations, and then the building next to it, the big one with like the strange nose, that's the US mission to the UN, and on the top floor is the NSA, and you can see they've even like extended the building out to give them like the perfect spying angle. So it's not a secret that intelligence agencies spy from embassies. The US does it, I'm sure France does it, the UK does it, Canada does it. But when your national telecommunication system, when your national phone system is insecure, when it's possible for someone with one of these devices to listen to calls, then you should be worrying about who is in your country using one of these devices. So there's a dedicated NSA team called the Special Collection Service, and this is the team that is based out of embassies. The SCS has 80 locations around the world at different US embassies and consulates. This is from one of the Snowden slides. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit because it's tough to read. So you can see the second line. There's one of these in Paris, of course, right? So the US government is spying on telephone calls in Paris. And I'm sure you guys are spying on telephone calls in Washington, D.C. That's how the spy game is played. No? Okay. Maybe you guys are better than we are, but everyone listens to everyone else's telephone calls from embassies. So why isn't anyone doing anything about this? Why is it still possible to use one of these IMSI catchers? Why haven't governments done anything? So it turns out that these devices, they were initially created for the military and the intelligence community and the spies, and then over the last 5 or 10 years, they've been given to law enforcement. There's now a thriving market. Law enforcement can buy them from surveillance companies who exhibit at conferences like Millipol. Just about a year and a half ago, the American public learned that the police and the authorities in the US actually put these on airplanes and fly them over cities. This is a story from Le Monde last year revealing that several French governmental organizations have been using these, and even before legislation was passed making IMSI catchers legal, the French authorities were using them. So you guys have this technology in use here. But over the last couple of years, over the last 6 months or the last year, we've learned, and the media has revealed, how widely available this technology is. So devices like this have been found outside the Houses of Parliament in London. Who knows who's operating them? Just 2 weeks ago, Vice did an expose where they called up a company in Hong Kong who was willing to sell them one for a few $1,000s, even though they were not pretending to be a government agency, they were a commercial party. And not only can you buy these from dozens of companies online for just a few $1,000s, you can actually build one yourself. So this is a photograph from DEF CON, the big US hacking conference. And a few years ago, a computer security researcher showed that with a few $100s, maybe like $300 or $400, you can build a device that will let you listen to other people's telephone calls, that will tell you which phones are nearby, that will track nearby phones, right? These devices, these IMSI catchers, which 20 years ago were only available to governments, were only used by spies, over the last 20 years, they've become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And they've gone from the intelligence agencies to the police. And then from the police, they've gone to sophisticated criminals. And then from sophisticated criminals, they've gone to criminals who can afford 500 euros or 2,000 euros. And now they've come to the open source community and anyone who wants to build one for themselves. Right? And when I'm standing up here and telling you that for a few $100s or a few €100, someone can build a device that will let a stranger listen to your telephone calls, I hope you're all thinking, that's crazy. Right? How is it possible that it's so cheap to listen to people's telephone calls? How is it possible that it's so cheap to spy on your neighbors or your competitors or for the paparazzi to listen to the telephone calls of celebrities? And the reason is because governments have not done anything over the past 20 years to force communications networks to fix the security flaws in their networks or to encourage the use of strong encryption. So I actually feel like we should be using more encryption. I feel like it's time for the public to be told how insecure their systems are, how insecure their telephone calls are, and I'm happy. I'm really happy that Apple and WhatsApp are finally delivering strong encryption to millions or billions of people, because these are the only companies that are giving us the technology to protect ourselves from the tools of surveillance that are now reaching every criminal who wants them. So, the criticism, I think, from government officials is, when bad guys use encryption, it causes the police to lose the ability to catch them. When terrorists and pedophiles and drug dealers use encryption, it means the authorities cannot stop these guys from doing what they're doing in our communities. And I hear that, and I'm sympathetic to that argument. I'm sure it's not easy to do law enforcement. I'm sure it's not easy to do intelligence and to live in a society and to have a job where the public expects you to be 100% successful. One terrorist attack is an attack too many, right? We expect perfection from our intelligence services, and I understand that it's probably very frustrating, to go from a world where you can listen to every telephone call to now a world where it's becoming very difficult to listen to FaceTime conversations and to read WhatsApp chats and iMessage chats. But I want to push back on this argument that encryption stops the authorities from listening to the bad guys. Encryption doesn't do that. Encryption makes it more expensive to spy on people. And in particular, it makes it too expensive to spy on everyone. In the past, governments have been able to collect information on far too many people because the cost of surveillance was low and because none of our communications were protected by strong cybersecurity technologies. Because of encryption, it's becoming more and more expensive, and so governments are having to focus their resources on just the people who are bad. So governments have other ways to spy. Even if the data that's going over the internet is encrypted, they can still hack your phone. They can still hack your computer. At some point, your communications have to be unencrypted so you can listen to them. At some point, your telephone calls have to be unencrypted so that you can hear them or speak back to the party. And at that moment, when the communications are unencrypted, governments can still get that data. Last year, when this Italian company hacking team themselves were hacked, I think it was a wake-up call for many people in the public who learned for the first time not just that hacking technology was available, but that it was so cheap and widely available that small governments, local police departments could now afford it. We learned that European police departments and the Ethiopian and Vietnamese governments were using essentially the same surveillance tools. And these tools actually still let you get data that would otherwise be encrypted. Of course, the French government doesn't need to buy stuff from Hacking Team. One of the stories from the Snowden archive revealed that that your intelligence agency, I guess it's DGSC, is that what it's called? Yeah. That they have made a powerful suite of surveillance software nicknamed Babar, I guess after the elephant. This is discovered by the Canadian Intelligence Agency. And then after researchers started looking at this, they then discovered other malware made by the French government. So the latest one is called, I guess, Casper, named after the friendly ghost. And so you guys have been using malware here for some time. Again, I'm not saying that encryption doesn't make life difficult, but if your government has a robust and mature capability to hack, then encryption isn't making things impossible. It's making things difficult, but it's not making things impossible. And if someone is really important, if someone is a high-value target and the government thinks they're a threat, for sure they're already hacking them. For sure they're already listening to communications on their device. They're extracting the data that would otherwise be encrypted because they have these capabilities. So, encryption doesn't stop all surveillance, but it does stop bulk surveillance. It stops governments from listening to everyone. The other thing that encryption stops is it takes away a feature that governments want. Right? It used to be that governments could just listen to you when you became a target. Right? So if the only communication service you're using is a telephone, governments can wiretap the telephone, but they cannot listen until they tell the phone company, this is a target. Once you're on their radar, once you're a target, then they do the wiretap, they listen to everything. But they cannot go back in time and say, let's listen to the phone calls from 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 2 years ago. That was in the world of the telephone. But then when consumers moved from the telephone to internet communications, and suddenly we had 5 years of emails sitting on Gmail, when telecoms companies were keeping a year or 2 years or 5 years of internet browsing records, suddenly not only could governments get access to data in real time, could learn what you're saying and who you're talking to in real time, but the moment you became someone of interest, they could go back in time. And they could see what you said last week, and what you emailed 2 months ago, and what you Googled, and what you researched a year ago. And I think that governments probably like this ability. Who wouldn't want to have a time machine and be able to go back and see everything that someone was saying 6 months or a year ago? I understand that governments like this capability, but realistically, encryption is taking away the time machine. Encryption is taking away the ability for governments to spy on everyone. Governments have to pick who they want to hack. And then encryption also prevents governments from going back in time. Once you hack someone's device, then you can see everywhere they go. Then you can listen to every conversation. Then you can read every instant message. But you cannot go back in time anymore. And so, my conclusion is this question, is it worth it? The tech community says that encryption is here to stay. These big tech companies are delivering strong end-to-end encryption to billions of users. And governments are saying, stop, please don't do this. Please slow down. Please at least turn it off by default. Make people have to choose it, or make people have to download an encrypted app. I think the debate is going to continue over the next months and years. For sure, we're going to see legislation in several countries. We've already seen in the last 3 weeks, 2 US states pass legislation requiring encryption backdoors in cell phones. We know that China has introduced legislation. So, the UK will probably do something as well. I think we need to ask ourselves, and particularly for this audience of people who care about cybersecurity, I think we need to be asking, what's more important? Do we want strong communication security? Do we want systems that are designed to protect against hackers, against sophisticated adversaries who will try and steal data? Or do we want systems that allow the government to get everything they've always been able to get, that allow governments to go back in time and monitor communications that took place before someone was on their radar? I don't know where we're going to go. My feeling is that cybersecurity is more important than an additional surveillance capability, but I think ultimately these will be decided by voters and by politicians. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Vous avez une question, c'est ça?
I would have a question if there is a question time.
Yes.
Yeah?
2 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, so the question is, I mean, you're putting the question as an either or. It's not even like a trade-off. I mean, we have to choose between safety and privacy. And I think if it really boils down to that, people will choose safety, because I'd rather be alive than free. Than, you know, if I have to choose. And in reality, we're assuming that there's no solution now that can be meaningful and keep both. And also, I think there is a wrong assumption as far as where we're standing now. You presented some of the app-based end-to-end encryption solution of Google and so on as something meaningful that make it substantially more difficult for governments and also non-governments to hack into it. But even Jacob Appelbaum and many other experts in describing programs like NSA Turbines, NSA Fox Acid, and Hacking Team, these systems can automate targeted endpoint exploitation. They can automate their management, and they can scale to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of devices. And once they get in, they can go also back to the future. Because if I get into your device, I get into your email, and I read all your emails in your background archive in Google, behind the point of encryption. So where we're standing now, we are standing in a really bad place. There's nothing to defend, because it's completely broken, and there are no checks and balances, because everything is happening hidden in a subverted way. So I'm just to finish, I would just hint to a possible solution in which you could find ways in which this lawful access could be not more technological, but based on organizational processes, kind of like what it was traditionally, without adding many technological factors that can add vulnerabilities. So have something more organizational. And I think, shouldn't we confront? There's no confrontation. I haven't seen any debates of experts taking seriously the game, the proposals to actually reconcile the two issues.
Okay,
and your community is avoiding this
I think
discussion.
I understand what you're saying. You know, the choice that you outlined at the beginning of your statement, this choice between national security and privacy, that's actually not the choice or the trade-off that I think is there. It's not a question of privacy versus national security. It's actually a question of cybersecurity versus national security. And in a room of people who care about IT security enough to listen to me talk at 6 o'clock, I would hope that you would understand that what we're talking about isn't about liberty. There is a privacy debate, and I think that liberties and civil rights are important. But cybersecurity is a national security issue. There is no way to design a system that lets the police listen to the communications of terrorists that a sophisticated adversary cannot hack into. And so you have to choose as a country, do you want a communications system that is resilient to the most sophisticated hackers? Or do you want a communication system that your national governments can use to spy on everyone? But you cannot have both. And you certainly cannot have a system that local law enforcement can use to wiretap that will keep hackers out. Because we all know that when you look at how sophisticated government agencies are, the federal agencies that have the most technological experience will be better at security, and the local police who have the least technological experience will be the easiest to hack. So this is not about privacy versus national security. This is about cybersecurity, and I'm saying we should be prioritizing cybersecurity.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.